For China, Taiwan is not just a crucial political issue. For the US, Taiwan is an opportunity to decelerate China's rise, or perhaps even fully stop it. A clash over Taiwan could easily become a much wider war, and given the interconnected nature of the globalized economy, the effects of such a war would be unlike anything else in history. The Russian attack on Ukraine, for example, might in the end look like a limited war compared to what might happen if Taiwan and China go to war, as that might easily lead to a war between US and China. Such events might drastically reshape both the political and economic landscape of the world. This video will show how. A new Cold War is a palpable possibility, one that can be played out in Conflict of Nations, sponsoring this video. It's a free-to-play real-time strategy game. You pick a real country and try to lead it to world domination. Not only are the diplomacy, alliances and the Cold War economies simulated, but you can actually turn the war into a hot one. Battles are simulated in detail. Choosing which fellow player to ally with is crucial, and I love that the game acknowledges it, that I can progress my cause through shrewd trading and seeding disagreements between my enemies. New Conflict of Nations players will get an exclusive gift. Click on the link in the description to get 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. Choose your country and dominate the world. Back to our video. If a war between the US and China happens, it might not be with Taiwan involved, but the chances of that are slim. Bigger wars need triggers, and Chinese missiles falling on Taiwan might be just one such trigger. After decades of practical peace and cooperation, the situation concerning Taiwan is getting worse. The US doesn't need China to help control the Soviet Union threat like in the 1980s. Since then, China transformed from a poor country to an industrial and even technological behemoth. So, even though the US position in the past was one of recognizing just one China, the communist one, that position is now changing. Donald Trump's trade war with China opened the floodgate, and now a much wider war is being waged. While not a hot war, it's one that's definitely resembling a new Cold War with each passing year. On one side, we have multiple US governments blocking certain Chinese companies, trying to stop technology influx into China, and trying to assemble various nations into alliances and partnerships containing China. On the other side, we have a hardline Chinese government that isn't shy of proclaiming contested islands and seas in the South China Sea as its own. A government that's increasingly heating up the rhetoric against Taiwan, reigniting the old ideas of taking Taiwan by force if needed. Chinese President Xi has said he'd smash any Taiwan's attempt at formal independence. Back in 2019, he even said, "We won't renounce the use of force and we reserve the option to take all necessary means when talking about reunification with Taiwan." For decades now, Taiwan was recognized only by a handful of small, non-influential countries. Taiwan has seen no need in formalizing its independence, but that may change with time. While most people in Taiwan still don't believe there will be a war, over the decades fewer and fewer people have identified as Chinese. So it's not unimaginable that at a certain point in the future, there might be an actual government in power in Taiwan which may seek to change the status quo and make Taiwan an official country for its people. While in the past such a move would be unthinkable due to the US regarding China as the far more important partner, in the last few years we've seen the US stance change. Today it fears China is an adversary which might become a more powerful nation one day, changing the current world order. While there are various agreements between Taiwan and the US signed, none of them explicitly state the US will fight for Taiwan. The farthest the US has gone so far is that it stated it would help Taiwan militarily to defend itself. In other words, it would supply it with weapons. But that stance of US ambiguity may change. The last few years there were more and more US officials saying the US should formally promise to defend Taiwan. Of course, while on one hand that might deter China, on the other hand it might even raise the chances for a war. For example, such a move may make the Taiwanese feel confident enough to formally proclaim independence, and China has publicly stated that's a red line for them. If China feels bold enough to go at Taiwan militarily, even some fairly limited military operations might quickly escalate into a full-blown war between China and the US. Or China and the US might, for example, do more and more military exercises near Taiwan. Both sides have already pushed up the number and scope of such exercises. If an accident happens where one side manages to lose lives of their soldiers in unclear circumstances, tensions might get so high that even some trigger-happy, unstable or full of fear troops on either side might open fire. Or the political games might get so heated that the US troops start flooding Taiwan as either a precaution or a taunt. If China feels it can't allow for even more US troops to populate Taiwan, as that might complicate its plans to subject Taiwan to its will, then some Chinese government may feel a preemptive attack is better than waiting for even more US troops to come in. The way the war starts could be very important. It could influence many factors and consequences later on. For example, if China just attacks Taiwan out of the blue, chances are pretty much every country in the world would label such a move as hostile. While not all countries might be able to cease trading with China, such an event would be so profound that a huge coalition of countries would unite in sanctioning China. And even a lot of countries might offer actual military help against China. If China attacks Taiwan after Taiwan proclaims official independence, again a lot of countries might unite in sanctioning China and not trading with it, but the overall number would be smaller. Such details might influence countries that would otherwise be sitting on the fence to remain de facto neutral, even if publicly they would condemn a Chinese military offensive. If the US troops, for example, would grossly increase their numbers on Taiwan beforehand, and the US would be seen as a facilitator of Taiwan changing its independent status, then even fewer countries might openly support an anti-China trading coalition. The same might happen if the US unilaterally recognizes an independent Taiwan. Which countries would react in which way under which conditions is of course impossible to predict. Even if all that's been mentioned actually happens, the sole fact that China used military force first would likely be enough that the countries usually aligned with the US form a no trade with China alliance. So the UK, Canada, Australia and Japan. Probably a lot of European countries as well, though there is no guarantee that the entire EU would agree on a common stance on China. Countries physically close to China would be unlikely to join a military alliance, and some might even seek to keep trading with China if their economies are already very much tied to it. One such example would be South Korea, which, while having ample military cooperation with the US, would have much more to lose if it picked a side, rather than if it stayed neutral. Even more problematic for such countries would be the fact China's land forces could conceivably reach them. A lot of China's navy and air forces would be needed for military operations against the US, yes, and a chunk of land forces would be used in Taiwan as well. But still a lot of Chinese land forces would be free to intervene on other battlefields, if, for example, South Korea allowed US aircraft to strike China from its territory. So the pros and cons of picking a side would not necessarily make sense for South Korea, the Philippines and similar countries. Russia might stay neutral as well. China might even ask it to stay neutral, or even not to create more trouble anywhere else in the world, like around Ukraine again. Russia getting in any way involved to help China might, in the eyes of the EU, very well place China in the category of a Russian military ally, and losing market access to Europe could be absolutely detrimental to China. The Himalayan barrier and the risk of Pakistan, a Chinese ally, getting involved in the war would likely mean India would not use its military force but be content with sanctions. Indeed, very few countries might actually help Taiwan militarily. Pretty much only the US, UK, Canada, Australia and Japan. Of those, Japan would be absolutely crucial. Literally, if Japan for whatever reason does not facilitate the US coalition war efforts, the US itself would choose not to go to war with China, and then the rest of the coalition would not go either. Japan's location is of paramount importance. If it allowed the coalition use of its territory as basis to project power against China, then that would make the war a plausibly winnable effort for the US and the coalition. If Japanese territory is not on the table, then the chances of Taiwan remaining independent become very slim. Without Japan, the US simply does not have enough bases to use against China. Certainly not enough to house thousands of planes and dozens of ships needed. Of all the neighboring countries to China, Japan is strong enough, distant enough, and leaning towards the US enough to provide such bases. The Philippines, for example, would be both politically unlikely to offer their territory to the coalition and infrastructurally deficient to make such an effort worthwhile. The thing is, Japan staying out of the war would be almost impossible. Current government is actually encouraging the US to openly promise to defend Taiwan. And there is the US-Japan Security Treaty, which says the two would defend each other if any is attacked in territories under Japanese administration. Basically, if China attacks the US base on Okinawa. Even if Japan's government and its people somehow balked at the treaty, the harsh reality is that the US military and the Japanese military are much too intertwined for that. There are dozens of US military bases all over Japan. Some bases are actually shared with Japanese forces. Some are near population centers. Even in the unlikely event that Japan decides it wants to stay neutral, it would never really evict the US troops by force. So what would happen is that the US would attack Chinese forces using bases on Japanese soil. China would in turn attack those bases. In the attacks, Japanese troops and civilians would inevitably get killed, and thus the support for staying neutral might wane until Japan would join the fight. The war would not be quick, because it would not be a war about Taiwan. It would be about who's the top dog in the world. Taiwan itself might even change hands a few times. Both China and whatever coalition the US assembles would pour everything they've got into such a conflict, at least up to the point where they see some chance of not losing the war. But the two sides would have different goals. The best China could hope for is that it manages to take and hold onto Taiwan, and at the very most take and hold some of Japan's Ryukyu Islands, perhaps even Okinawa. Other territorial gains would be all but impossible for China, and even the Ryukyu Islands might be unlikely, as they could instead be used as a bargaining chip to force Japan out of the war, thus also neutering the US. But it would not really be about territorial gains for China anyway, save for Taiwan. If China would manage to show the rest of the world that the coalition's military is unable to break it, if the US or Japan would simply cease attacking China, China would proclaim victory. If the US manages to inflict enough damage to the Chinese military, then there would be no way for China's military to hold on to Taiwan. Whatever forces China might land on Taiwan, if they're completely cut off by land and air from China, would eventually be forced to surrender under the US attacks and Taiwanese insurgency. If China launches an attack on Taiwan but proves unable to hold it, then that would constitute clear US victory. For that to happen, the Chinese Navy and Air Forces would have to be nearly destroyed. While the brunt of the Chinese army might still be operational, it would be of little consequence to the overall balance of power in the future. But there's another possible chain of events. Even if China holds Taiwan and the US stops its attacks, in the very long run, and we're talking probably decades, China might still lose, or it could prove itself to be the victor, because it's all about the long-term effects on the economy. But that's a much more complicated course of events going far into the future. More immediately, the whole world would suffer an economic downturn on a scale comparable to World War II. Just who'd trade with who during and after the war would be crucial. There would likely be a blue and a red bloc of countries not trading with each other, and a neutral bloc of countries trading with everyone. Crucially, the EU might fall either into the blue bloc or the neutral bloc of countries. It's possible that the Russian attack on Ukraine has galvanized the EU and NATO, and even a remotely similar war might also produce a more unified economic response against China as well. Shipping would be disrupted left and right, even if cargo doesn't go through any of the warring countries. Of course, there are production chains set up for pretty much every complex product that inevitably goes through China, Taiwan, or countries in the region. Still, as shown, unless China manages to keep a good number of countries, including EU ones, on its side, it would be losing more than the US, trade-wise, for at least until the political fallout settles. Certain products, which are crucial for any today's economy, would be severely impacted, like electronics. Not only does Taiwan absolutely dominate the global production of computer chips, but most of the other producers are so close to the battlefield that they would also be impacted. The Western world would very much feel the lack of electronics for everyday products, and their prices would skyrocket. China could actually be somewhat better off comparably when it comes to semiconductor shortages, as it handles so much of the production chain for those within China. Unlike the US, for example, whose companies own a huge chunk of the semiconductor market, but actual access to semiconductor factories due to the war would be very much lacking. Actually, that could be said for a lot of products. China has become the world's factory over the decades. Be it various complex tools, machines, cars or electronics, most of them are made and assembled in China, sourced from raw materials from around the world. Indeed, not having access to a lot of those raw materials would severely impact China's economy. Oil and gas are often mentioned as raw materials that China would be lacking most, due to tanker ships not reaching it. China extracts a little over half of its natural gas needs domestically. Also, roughly a third of the imported gas comes through Asian pipelines, which means close to 30% of current Chinese gas needs might not reach China for as long as the US keeps those shipping lanes shut down. When it comes to crude oil, the situation is worse for China. Much more oil has to be imported, and some 83% of that imported oil comes by ships, which are subject to blockades, which means 60% of Chinese oil needs might not be able to reach China. Of course, the needs of today do not equate to the needs during the war. While war production might surge both in the US and in China, that production is dwarfed by commercial products, which would take a huge hit during the war. So in effect, China might need less oil, gas and other raw materials until it manages to find new markets for its products. Still, even if it manages to find enough new markets, its economy would definitely be stifled by much higher oil prices within China. On the other hand, total energy needs would likely be augmented by other energy sources. Indeed, compared to coal, all other energy sources used in China look pale. China is a huge coal producer, covering 93% of all its current needs. Curiously, if an oil blockade is implemented against China, there would be an oversupply of oil in the West, leading to price drops after the initial rise as the war starts. So during the hot war itself, neither side would really lack the raw materials to either wage war or produce weapons and ammunition at their maximum efficiency, certainly not for a few years to come. But overall economies, being much bigger and more demanding, would feel that sting of inadequate raw materials and inadequate market access. While the US problems would be ones of redistributing their supply networks and market access, Chinese problems would include those, but also add finding extra markets to effectively utilize their industry potential. Taiwan itself would be absolutely ravaged by war. If Taiwan's morale proves to be high, the Chinese invasion attempt might be slowed down. A month or a year may pass, mass bombardments may happen, literally millions might die, and much of the world might unite against China in face of such suffering. Whoever ends up controlling it in the end would control a bunch of urban rubble and a starving population. Its once industrial and technological edge would essentially be lost. Neither China nor the US would find it in their interest to rebuild Taiwan to the technological level it enjoys today. Japan would see some destruction, but fairly limited to military sites and some ports. Nothing that can't be rebuilt fairly quickly. When it comes to destruction within China, that would really depend on what sort of coalition the US might assemble, what bases the coalition might have access to. It might be that China sees only sporadic strikes to its military and industrial targets, if the coalition proves to be too weak to fight through the Chinese defenses. Or the Chinese coastline might see a lot of industry and ports demolished, if the Chinese defenses eventually falter. Though, given how vast China is and how many targets there are, we're still talking about just several percent of Chinese industry. The US itself is unlikely to see big destruction or life loss, save for a selected few military targets that China might reach. Sporadic missile attacks on Hawaii and Alaska are possible, perhaps even on the US west coast as well, but they would all be symbolic raids. The US economy would obviously be hit hard by such a tectonic shift in the global economy, but the ecosystem of countries that the US would still be trading with would likely be bigger than China's, and the US would be less exposed to raw material shortages. Everyone would lose compared to today. In the short term, China would likely lose more economically. In the long term, well, that's way too hard to predict. But one thing is clear: the sheer size of China, its population, and its rising economy today means that whatever is true today will not be true in the future. If the war happens today, a lot of the predictions mentioned might come true, but if it happens 5 or 10 years from now, China might be better equipped for sustaining itself after such a war. Which is why we, as humankind, are still not surely faced with such a war. It all depends on Chinese leadership. It may decide Taiwan is more crucial to them than the medium-term economic future of China. Or it may decide the economic rise of China isn't worth the cost incurred with Taiwan war. US decisions are also a factor. If US leadership tries to decouple China from the West, regardless of Taiwan, then the chance for a war in Taiwan and later even a global war might still rise up. Even if the US doesn't get involved in the war, let's say in the case that Taiwan doesn't want to put up a fight and China manages a super quick invasion, that sole event would change the global political order. Blocks of countries would be fully formed, and the new Cold War that we've so far only seen the beginning of would overnight go into overdrive. Humankind would be thrown back where it was in the late 1940s. There would be a new Iron Curtain, prices around the world would spike up due to broken up globalization, and people would live in fear of a nuclear Armageddon once again. Now, a few more details on Conflict of Nations. There are real people controlling those opposing countries in the game, and there can be up to 128 players in-game. It's a real-time strategy, alright, but it's methodical. You issue an order and, like in the real world, that order may lead to a battle taking place hours later. Whole games can take weeks to complete. There are over 100 different modern weapon systems modeled in-game. Ballistic missile subs, attack helicopters, stealth jets, they're all in there. The military research tree is huge with over 250 items to research. It's up to you to choose your strategy, where to send troops, what kind, whether to try diplomacy, but prepare for epic battles to take over the world. New Conflict of Nations players can get a special gift. Click on the link in the description to get 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription. And remember, Binkov may talk about hypothetical wars, but only real peace can bring us all together.